Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, sitting in for Barbara Altman. Our guest today is Bill Ayers. Ayers is a retired professor in the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago, formerly holding the titles of Distinguished Professor of Education and Senior University Scholar. He's the founder of the Small Schools Workshop and the Center for Youth and Society. Ayers has written extensively about social justice, democracy and education, the cultural context of schooling, and teaching as an essentially intellectual, ethical, and political enterprise. He is currently the Vice President of the Curriculum Studies Division of the American Educational Research Association. Ayers is also known for his activism for social justice and against the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s. In 1969, he co-founded the radical left organization Weather Underground. In the wake of those turbulent years, he has continued his work as a political and social activist. Ayers gave a lecture titled Teaching and Organizing for Social Justice on April 26, 2012, as guest of the College of Education. His talk was part of the year-long conflict series. Bill, thanks for taking the time for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Can you tell us how your family circumstances and upbringing influenced your trajectory first in college?
It's hard to know. I think that I grew up in enormous privilege in the suburbs of Chicago. I grew up in the 40s and 50s and went away to college in 1963. So certainly growing up in the 50s with the kind of quiet and kind of assumed soft landing of the 50s certainly influenced my outlook on life, I think. But when I went away to the University of Michigan, I found myself blinking my eyes open and found a world in flames. And I was immediately drawn into the civil rights movement and then the peace movement. And the more engaged I got, the more serious I got, and it eventually became my life's work.
So how did you get attracted to leftist politics in particular at that time?
Yeah, I didn't think of myself. I mean, my parents weren't political. My father was the chairman of Commonwealth Edison, and he would have called himself his whole life apolitical. But I think that my parents did speak the values of the basic core American values. We care for each other. We try to be good people. We try to be kind. We try to be generous. And to come awake in a world where segregation was the defining issue of the day, and the civil rights movement was creating a moral framework that was entirely different and activist, drew me into activism. I wouldn't have called myself a leftist until much later, and even now I'm a little skeptical of those kind of labels. But look, I came to Michigan in '63. I dropped out in '64 and joined the Merchant Marines. I was a merchant mariner for a while. I came back to the United States just as the Vietnam War was igniting, and I went to the first ever teach-in about anything, and it was about the Vietnam War. And I heard the president of Students for a Democratic Society, a man named Paul Potter, who's passed away 30 years ago. But Paul addressed these students, and among the things he said was, you should live your life in such a way that it doesn't make a mockery of your values. And that phrase has echoed in my mind ever since. The next day, I was arrested in the draft board with 39 other students and one marvelous professor, trying to disrupt the normal functioning of the draft board. But even then, I would say my politics were instinctive, intuitive, and not subject to labels. I thought, in fact, I remember you're an English scholar. When I went to court, I said to the judge, as Shakespeare said, action is eloquence, and the judge frowned at me and gave me 15 days in jail. It was an idealism more than it was a leftism. But then I did join Students for a Democratic Society, and I still have my membership card, which still bears the opening line of the founding document, the Port Huron Statement, and that line is, we are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uneasily at the world we inherit. That described me in 1963, it describes me today.
And is there a particular event, or is it more a sort of evolution where you became increasingly radicalized in your activism?
Well, to me, radicalized is not a dirty word. I mean, to be a radical is to try to get to the root of things. So yes, there were a series of things. I was drawn to the civil rights movement. My first protest was against segregation in Ann Arbor. I was with a group of young people who themselves were burning with the desire to live lives of ethical intention and moral rectitude. So yes, I mean, one thing after another, but to be a radical meant to try to understand what was under things. So here's how it evolved for me. I was arrested in 1965. At that point, 70% of Americans supported the war. And even at the University of Michigan, we were outnumbered 10-1 in terms of people's attitudes towards the war. But I spent the next 3 years organizing. I went to Detroit, for example, every summer as part of a project called Vietnam Summer, and knocked on doors in working class neighborhoods. I don't know what I taught them, but they taught me an awful lot about the meaning of this country, what's going on, what it feels like to be a person working in the auto plants and so on, and what it feels like to have your son or your cousin or your nephew drafted and sent to Vietnam. So for those 3 years, I grew a lot. I was arrested a lot, I demonstrated a lot, but it was that organizing, talking to strangers, that changed me. At the same time, the Black movement, the Black freedom movement, was increasingly vocal about opposing the war. King in particular. Read his speech April 4th, 1967. You won't believe it's King. It's such a radical speech. And then vets coming home and telling the truth. John Kerry, senator from Massachusetts, telling the Senate Armed Services Committee in 1967 or 8, we commit war crimes in Vietnam every day, not as a matter of choice, but as a matter of policy. That threw the country against the war. So we felt like we had won, and when Lyndon Johnson stepped away from the presidency, we were convinced we'd won. And we had a rally on the steps of the University of Michigan president's house, and he said, congratulations, you've won a great victory. We thought we had, this is the end of March 1968, we were ecstatic. 5 days later, King was dead. 2 months later, Kennedy was dead. And 2 months after that, it was clear the war would not end. And here was the problem, Paul. Every week that the war went on, 6,000 people were killed. Every week. There was no end in sight. So what do we do? And at that point, in my own family, I'm the middle of 5 children. One of my siblings joined the Democratic Party and tried to build a peace wing. One went to the factories of the Northeast and tried to build a working class movement against the war. One went to the communes of Oregon. And one went to Europe, ran away. And I did what I did. Was it smart? Was it great? Was it terrific? Not really. But did any of us have the answer of how to end this war? That's, I guess, what radicalized me, this sense that I didn't just want to end the Vietnam War. I wanted to end the system that seemed to make war so inevitable and so predictable.
How would you characterize your days as a member of the Weather Underground?
You know, kind of normal days. For someone of my generation, we lived fairly normal lives. We weren't, I mean, I think the image looking back all these years, 40, 50 years, the image is, somehow wearing big trench coats and ducking into alleys. It wasn't like that. We were part of the youth movement. We lived with other young people in youth communities, whether it be, Berkeley or Northern California or wherever. But we lived with young people. We worked ordinary jobs. I worked, off the kind of money economy. I worked as a chef in kitchens. I worked as a day laborer. I worked as a farm worker, so that we could get cash and not be in the kind of Social Security system. But other than that, we led pretty ordinary lives. We were charged with politics, and so we were talking and thinking politically all the time. But I don't think of myself as a tactician, so it wasn't the tactics of the Weather Underground were not that important to me, and still are not. Certainly we crossed lines of legality and possibly common sense, but it's not the case that we were out of our minds or that we were spending our days, as kind of flamethrowers from the left. We weren't.
I mean, as you describe it, it sounds like it must have felt like a natural evolution from the process that you were going through.
Well, it did and it didn't. I mean, I write about this in my book, Fugitive Days. I write about the fact that as the war escalated and as we thrashed around trying to find ways to end it, there was certainly a lot of hope in what we were doing, but there was also a lot of despair and a lot of confusion. And we split, Students for Democratic Society split into a zillion factions. The anti-war movement split. The crisis in democracy was reflected. I mean, in other words, Americans opposed the war, but we couldn't stop it. And so that crisis was reflected in the anti-war movement. But, we debated what else to do, and we began to split and split and split. So the Weather Underground went through its own kind of crazy arguments with itself. Should we escalate? Should we be, more destructive? How should? And the faction that won, the group that won out, was the group that said we can carry out symbolic actions that are in concert with the general desire for the United States to end the war. Yes, we want to make a revolution, but we're not going to do it by hurting people. We're not going to do it by, the only way to make a genuine revolution is to convince the majority of people that you're right, and that's what we settled on.
You've made it very clear that many of your actions and your convictions are the result of idealism, but it's also quite clear that your ideals have often been challenged. Do you still consider yourself an idealist?
Absolutely, in the sense that I don't consider myself an idealist in the sense that I'm foolish or living in some kind of a utopian fantasy. But I think if you're not an idealist, people say, well, the young should be idealists. I'm almost 68. I think the old should be idealists. And by idealists, I mean positing an ideal, a possible world that's worth living for, and then trying to get there. But I feel like I've always been a realist and an idealist. In other words, I try to live with one foot firmly planted in the mud and muck of the real world that we understand and know. And one foot is striving towards a world that could be, but is not yet. And I don't think there's any way to be a good citizen or resident or even a moral person if you can't see, standing right next to the world as such, a possible world. So yes, I'm an idealist in that sense, but I don't think in the taking leave from my senses sense at all.
Do you think that we don't have enough idealists now?
No, I think that we have a lot of idealists, and I think that the young people today blow my mind every day. I feel very much of, as I said in the SDS statement, I feel very much a person of this generation. I don't feel like I'm a person who, first of all, I don't think anyone lives by decades. I don't remember in December 31st, 1969, looking at my watch and saying, oh no, it's almost over. That's marketing. That's, the 60s is mostly sold back to us as myth and symbol. And for some, it's the devil's own workshop, and for others, it's the highest possible moment that we could have lived in. That does a disservice to today, because today, young people are smarter, hipper, more creative, more energetic than we ever were. The largest anti-war demonstration I ever went on was when? 2003. Okay, that's hard to believe because I went on anti-war demonstrations all through the 60s and 70s, but they weren't as large as the one I went on in 2003. I think that what ignites a movement, as opposed to good people trying to do good things, is a mystery. The day before Occupy happened, you didn't know it was coming, and neither did I. The day after, inevitable. And that's true of Rosa Parks, and that's true. So I don't at all despair for the moment we're in. In fact, if anything, I despair about the old people looking longingly for a ship that already left the shore. That's boring and irrelevant. We should all be living with a forward lean and trying to get busy being the intergenerational people we are.
So tell me what you think about the future of the Occupy movement, since you brought it up, and I think it's such a fascinating phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. I think of Occupy not as a point of arrival, but as an invitation, a metaphor, very much like SDS. I mean, SDS was an invitation. It didn't actually have a membership list. It wasn't actually disciplined. We were, a possibility. We were an opening of the public square. That's what Occupy has done, and Occupy's already won in the sense that they've shifted the frame on a couple of discussions. Nobody would care about Mitt Romney's taxes if it weren't for Occupy. Nobody would be saying the 1% are cleaning up if it weren't for Occupy. So they've already won, and they've opened a public space where every grievance and every hope can come and find some life. That's, to me, what it's all about. That's great. I can't predict the future. So I'm not an optimist, nor am I a pessimist. Nobody can predict the future. Cynics think they can. Idealists, optimists think they can. They can't. The reality is that I get up every morning trying to nourish what I think of as the politics of confidence. I want this to happen. I'm going to work for it today. I'm going to work overtime today. And then I go to bed disappointed. And I get up the next morning all fired up to do it again, because I don't see the point of living any other way. What's the point of saying, oh, all is lost, and burying your head in your pillow? That makes no sense to me. So I get up every day intending to change the world. And I go to bed every night slightly disappointed, but still I'm coming back, and I'll be here as long as I'm stepping forward. That's my life.
So obviously, for you, one of the main ways that you try to realize your activism is through education.
True.
So can you talk a little bit about how you became involved in education?
Well, I was arrested, as I said, in 1965. I went to jail, and one of the people who was in jail with me, his wife had just started a freedom school. And so I walked out of jail and into my first teaching job, first as a volunteer, then as a teacher, then as a director of this small freedom school. And you know, from that day until this, teaching has always been linked in my mind with the possibility of a better world, the possibility of social justice, the possibility of racial justice, the possibility of a more peaceful and balanced life. So these things are tied up in my mind, but that's how I first got involved. I also think it suits me in a couple of different ways. One is that as a teacher, I really believe that you have to go into the classroom with a kind of a faith, unproven, untested, but a faith that every person who comes before you is a three-dimensional creature with a heart, a mind, a spirit, a soul, a brain, experiences, hopes, dreams, aspirations that have to be taken into account. As a community organizer, it was the same exact idea. You knock on a door, the assumption is whoever answers that door is worthy of your attention, is worthy of... So I'm a believer in the radical democratic ideal that every human being is of incalculable value. I believe that as a teacher. I believe that as an activist. It doesn't mean that we're equal, but we are each of incalculable value. And that has to be kind of what powers us as teachers. But that's how I got involved. And it fit my politics to be that kind of teacher as well.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Children's Community School and what was special about it?
That's what I was referring to as the Children's Community School. It was in Ann Arbor. It was started by 3 young mothers who were depressed at the idea that their children would go off to a school that was overly competitive, that was racially segregated, in which girls were not permitted to do the things boys were permitted to do. And they decided to start a little preschool based on those values. And so our little slogan was, you know, an experiment in freedom and equality. And that's what we tried to do. Very important to my growth and development as a teacher.
How has educational policy and the curriculum changed since the 60s, and what do you think about that change?
Well, I'm not sure I can make a comparative change. I think that it's contested space. It was contested space then, it's contested space now. There's never been a golden age in teaching, but the real threat today is that the noisiest voices pushing a kind of so-called reform agenda are the voices that want to privatize the public schools. It takes a range of forms, but it kind of coheres around privatized management as if the market somehow was the best way to imagine public education, crushing the teachers' union, and reducing education to whatever's testable. This is a disaster for democracy because you know, I think of education and schooling much differently. I think of it as a human right. Article 26 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights says all people should have the right to an education, and it should be free and common in the early years, and it should be focused on the development of the full human personality. That's what I believe, and that's what I fight for.
Have your ideas about education evolved over your career at all?
Oh, I think so. I think that every year I learn something. Every year I get you know, more experience kind of chunked onto me. Right now, I mean, I'm looking at things like there's a wonderful documentary that everyone should see called Louder Than a Bomb, and it's about the poetry slams that have gone on in Chicago for a decade. I've been a judge on the finals of the National Poetry Slam every year for the last decade. It's a form of education. It's a form of pedagogy that is life-affirming, that is positive, progressive. And so, yeah, I've only learned about that in the last decade. There are many other examples. Youth radio out of Berkeley is an example of a project that should be spread and is spreading. So, as I say, education is contested space. It's in the public. Obviously, the public should be fighting about who should we teach and who's the public in public education and what should we teach. And in that conversation, I want to be an active voice.
What attributes make a good teacher in your view?
A good teacher, I mean, I mean, you have to want to teach, and the astonishing thing to me is that young people today, in spite of all the public humiliation and the attack on teachers and the kind of insane and misdirected scapegoating of teachers as if they're somehow the enemy. The interesting thing is I'm a retired person on a pension, and so I'm one of the enemies of the state because I'm taking my pension and I'm a teacher. So, but how teachers became the enemy is really beyond description. And the framing of that discussion, you know, we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom. As soon as a politician says that, they win the argument. Because what am I going to say? My granddaughter deserves that lazy, incompetent? No. But if I get to the microphone and I say every classroom deserves, and this is what it takes to be a good teacher, every kid in a public school deserves an intellectually grounded, morally competent, compassionate, caring, interested, curious, well-rested, and well-paid teacher in the classroom, I win that argument. So those are some of the qualities. But I'd say that the challenge of teaching is really just a couple of things. You have to see the students beyond the blizzard of labels, beyond the whole structuring of invisibility that is so much a part of our schools. You need to struggle to see the student as a three-dimensional creature, just like yourself, and you have to create an environment that's big enough, wide enough, and deep enough so everyone can find something familiar and something strange, something that they can do well and something they have to reach for. And that's the dance of the dialectic in teaching.
So you said that the sort of push to privatization is a terrible thing for democracy. Say a little bit more about your sense of the relationship between education and democracy.
They are the same thing, and without a strong public school system, democracy is diminished. And if you think about it, throughout history and throughout the world, every school, every group of school people has certain goals that are the same. We want the kids to show up on time, learn the subject matter, do their homework, stay away from drugs, etc. Those are the things we all want. We want that, but they also wanted that in fascist Germany. They also want that in medieval Saudi Arabia. They also want that in apartheid South Africa. So what's distinct about a democracy is this sense that we are committed to this precious, fragile, and in many ways damaged ideal, which is every one of us is of incalculable value, which means in education that we want whatever the wisest and most privileged parents have for their children, that's what we want as a baseline for all children. So whatever the Obamas and the Duncans and the Joel Kleins and the Bill Gates have for their kids, that's what I want as a baseline for all kids. So look at the Obamas and Arnie Duncan, and frankly, my kids as well. They all went to the University of Chicago Laboratory School. They found their class size capped at 20, a unionized and well-respected teacher corps, well-resourced classrooms, a curriculum based in part on asking your own questions and pursuing your own answers. Okay, if that's good enough for my kids and for the Obama kids, then why is something less than that okay for other people's children? All this reform language that's going on and the creation of these schools are schools that none of these people would send their kids to. No art, no physical education, no clubs, no drama, no music, no way. So if it's not good enough for their kids, it's not good enough for the community's kids.
My son goes to a very good public school in Eugene.
Nice.
His calculus class last year had 56 students in it.
Wow. That's an outrage.
Outrage.
It's an outrage. And we shouldn't allow it. And frankly, you know, so I see an article in the New York Times. Upper left corner, there's a little picture of an African-American girl at a farm looking into a pig pen. And the headline of the article is, trip to the farm may improve test scores. And I wanted to jump off a bridge. Do you think the Obamas would say, we're not going to let Malia and Sasha go to the farm, the concert, the music lesson, the swimming lesson, Hawaii, the camping trip, unless it improves their test scores? We would never say it about our children. Why do we so glibly say it about other people's children?
Are there any specific reforms that you are working for in public education in the United States now, or that you think we need?
For a long time, I founded an organization called the Small Schools Workshop, and in many ways, small schools is a metaphor for the kind of reform that I think we need. Our idea was and is to break up big factory-like high schools into smaller learning communities. But it's a metaphor for three things. One is every kid known well by a caring adult. Two is a faculty that's so small that they can meet around a table like this and actually talk about teaching and learning. And 3 is a school that invites parent participation, not as a kind of an adjunct to doing our schoolwork, but as full participants in forming and creating the schools. Again, good private schools have that. Why isn't that the ideal we strive for in our public schools?
So in the last couple of minutes, would you mind saying if you've felt that you've changed over the past 40 years?
I mean, I change every day, as we all do. I mean, but I think the one thing that I feel very strongly about is that I tell my students, I ask them, are you a work in progress? And they all say, absolutely. Have you done everything you want to do? No, absolutely not. And I say, well, this is going to shock you, but I'm a work in progress. And every day I'm different, and every day I have to get up and ask myself, what now? Where am I going now? I've been with my partner, the mother of my children, the grandmother of my grandchildren, for over 40 years. And I like to say every morning we wake up and say, should we stay together? Okay, let's try it one more day. But I think you have to kind of live with that kind of forward-looking sense. The shocking thing is my mentor from graduate school is now 96. She still is a work in progress. And she says to me, I still have things to do. Exactly. We all have things to do. It's the human condition. So yes, I think we change over time. And people often ask me, do you have any regrets? Hundreds, thousands, millions of regrets. How can you not? I mean, 20-year-olds have regrets. 6-year-olds have regrets. But you know, the thing I don't regret is opposing the war in Vietnam with every fiber of my being, and being a peace activist to this day, resisting all the attempts to silence and push back. But no, I think I'm changing every day, and hopefully wiser and smarter and cuter, but God knows. You be the judge of that.
Well, that I think is a wonderful place to end because of your extreme cuteness. I can testify to it. Okay. We've been speaking with Bill Ayers. He's a retired professor in the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He writes and speaks widely about education and democracy. Ayers is known for his activism in social justice and against the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. He gave a lecture titled Teaching and Organizing for Social Justice on April 26, 2012 as a guest of the College of Education. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching.